Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as supporting me on Buy Me a Coffee, Subscribe Star, and Locals, and make sure to check out my Substack. So I'm joined by Wandering Panda. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I did a two-part series on collapse and preparing for collapse. And he commented on the video saying that he had some practical experience on at least some of the earlier phases that I was talking about. And I thought, well, this would make it for a really good way to move from theory to something practical and sort of tie it together in an integrated way. So yeah, Wandering Panda, why don't you first introduce yourself? Tell us how you move from a more, integrated into the system mindset to the idea that we need to get out.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. And sort of the idea is I grew up in the burbs and I was playing way too many video games as a teenager. I ended up becoming a Fed more or less and dropped into the infantry in one of the outfits. And then eventually that life ended and I'm back in the burbs and I did not like a lot of what was going on around me. There was just different things that were giving me some pause. I had the 2012 gun scare and Ron Paul, and sort of went down the prepper route. Eventually, just became disillusioned with that, and amidst all that, was able to sell different property I had owned and get into homesteading on a small plot of land and start building from there.
Nice. So you watched the two episodes that I had on Collapse, episode 60 of the Casual Stream, and then episode 61, how to prepare for it. So how did you find my channel, and specifically what were your takeaways from those two episodes?
Sure, I'm trying to remember. I can't remember if I heard Charlemagne mentioning you one time or if it. You've been on AA a couple of times, yeah.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, that might have been my introduction. It was either somebody mentioning you about history, and it's like, oh yeah, you gotta listen to Praise of Folly, or it might have been when you were on with AA. And so yeah, that put you on my radar, and then I saw you talking about collapse and all that. And I was like, well, I like hearing folks talk about that. And so then you got into some of the nuts and bolts, and I was like, oh, Lance, like let's this is good stuff. But I at the same time, I hope guys know what they're getting into when they start going down this road.
Yeah. So how about you begin with what were some of the was there anything that you read or experienced or were exposed to that led you to say that I need to change my life in this direction?
So this is gonna sound so cringe, but yeah, dude, it was the that 2012 gun scare, and it was Ron Paul. I'm seeing Boehner at the RNC, and he's like, "Oh, the eyes have it," and they're just ripping the rug out from Ron Paul. And I'm like, I can't believe this, man. And then you had like, what was it? I think it was right after Newtown or whatever, and it's like, oh, they're gonna take our guns away, and I'm like, well, I like guns, so I got some more. And then that was like, well, what am I even doing here? There was some other stuff on the back end in that some of my plans post military were not working out the way they could, or the way that I wanted them to, and it sort of popped up like, well, I have the ability to go and start a farm, so let me take advantage of this, and that's what I did.
All right. Just real quickly, we got a message in the chat saying that you're a little loud. Could you reduce the volume a little bit on your end?
I will do my best.
Okay. Well, the next question I have then is what were some of the challenges in starting homesteading?
Let's see. Is this any better?
Yes.
I tried to lower it manually. Okay.
Yes.
Uh, the challenge on starting a homestead is going to be the same as keeping a homestead, and it's cash flow. It's absolutely going to be cash flow. That's going to be your biggest hurdle. The way I sort of think about farms is that you've kind of got a hobby farm, which it's in its name. It is a hobby. You're paying for everything. I separated homestead, and I say that a homestead pays for itself, and it's more of a closed loop system, but that's it. And then an actual farm is going to pay for itself and then also generate enough income that you can keep building and not be paying for it out of pocket. But yeah, cash flow is the absolute hardest part, but it's not insurmountable. And so, like, if you want to talk about acquisition of land, um, we all think that we have to go and actually purchase land and get a mortgage. One of the things that different people have pushed and that I think is a great idea, especially for a young single guy, is start leasing land. That really lowers it's going to lower your liability with the bank. It's also going to lower your liability with whatever it is you're trying to do, because you can't, if you're leasing land, you've got 10 acres or whatever, you can't go in there and dump a whole bunch of cash in there because it's not your land. They're not going to allow the infrastructure. And that really limits the trouble you can get yourself into by going down the wrong path and realizing $80,000 in, like, oh crap, what I do.
Yeah. Now, prior to the discussion, prior to going live, we both mentioned preppers. So what's important about the preppers as a subculture, right, is on the one hand that they're doing an experiment. I think in the long run that is necessary, even if we might have our private disagreements on how they're doing it. But right now, the fail conditions are pretty low. Like, it's safe. Like, if you fail, you're not going to die. So this is actually a really important time to experiment and try to find what works. Now, I guess we could learn a lot of things that don't work, which is, I suppose, still useful. But I think that this is, and again, this sort of like low fail threshold, that's sort of where you're in as well. Like, you, even if you were to fail, it wouldn't be catastrophic. But now we have the time to go through the learning curve, which will be steep.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll mess with people when they come out here and it's like, my learning curve is like this. And I take my hand and I bend it 90 degrees at the wrist. I mean, it's going straight up. Again, way too many video games as a teenager. I'd like to slap myself. But like you said, the impact of failure is so low right now. And frankly, that I'm not advocating bankruptcy or anything, but it's like we get so in our heads in our 20s and we're like, everything has to be going perfect. It's like everything doesn't have to go perfect, even if you fail utterly and you go bankrupt. Okay, dude, I mean, you're still alive. You're still going to make life work. I don't want that to happen, and I think there's absolutely ways you can avoid that. But yeah, I think you're right on the money. Like, right now is a fantastic time to go through the get forged in the fire of all the different hurdles, because man, anybody can go out right now. They can go to an auction and they can pick up horses, they can pick up sheep and cattle. uh, there is no free range branding and fighting over these different resources. If you've got 2 acres, if you've got 20 acres, you are more than capable of starting something.
Yeah. So one of the other things that you were sort of resonated with was my sort of discussion about provisioning the homestead. So, and I'll just sort of open up with my thoughts on it and just toss it off to you. So, I mean, one way to feed a population is through intensive agriculture, which, I mean, beyond a certain threshold, I guess is a prerequisite. But, none of us, I think, are really thinking of building mass urban metropolises. I think a lot of us would agree that's part of the problem. A really labor. So if you use an EROI formula, energy return on energy investment, I think the most efficient way to get calories and resources is from animal products. Now, I mean, yeah, you could eat the animal's flesh, and I'm not opposed to that, but I think the principle that I would use is a kind of appreciation principle. So cows, chickens, sheep, and goats all provide something of value. You can either eat it, like milk and eggs, or turn it into something edible, like, mayonnaise or yogurt or cream or butter, or you could wear it like sheep's wool. And so you have this sort of movable avenue for like food and clothes that just follows you where you go, which is why a lot of nomads and pastoralists use these. But even like on the American frontier, there was a lot of of these. I guess you could also include pigs, because what pigs are good at is they're like trash disposal. So you don't really use them other than eating, but what they're good for is their trash disposal for everything else. So, like in the Middle Ages, you used to have curfew where you let the pigs out and they clean up all the offal that people had, and then you could eat them later on. So, like those animals are like a core of like a homestead.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the cool thing about pigs too is if you don't have the money for a plow or any sort of a tiller or anything, get some pigs fenced in and give them the slop, and they're going to get bored. They're naturally going to root around and start tur turning up that dirt and allowing you to go in there and actually start sowing seeds after you've moved the pigs off. And the big thing with animal products, and absolutely you're going in the right direction, is it's not just meat. We that manure working in some sort of multi-species system. We sort of got lost once we became specialists, and everybody knows this, but it applies to agriculture as much as medicine or anything else. We got lost and we said, "Hey, we're only going to raise corn on this farm, or we're only going to do hay, or we're only going to raise cattle." And when we have these diversified small holdings, we really get to set up our own system and we say, hey, I'm going to start with my cattle. They're going to run through on this. I'm going to have my horses come through after my cattle because they back clean up and they will tear up the pasture. And then after I get my horses and my cattle move through, I'm going to run my chickens behind. That way they can tear up all the manure that's there. They're going to be feeding off the insects that are in there, but they're also spreading the manure and giving a more even covering. And so just sort of these ideas of how we can keep integrating and working together are going to, I think, allow for, if not an actual much greater efficiency, certainly a much greater efficiency in our lack of need of outside inputs.
Right. So this is the problem that we're dealing with. So if you have a complex system that is abstract and managed by experts, it could be extremely efficient in getting certain results. But the problem then becomes that it is attenuated along a scale with many intervening steps. So one, it makes it vulnerable because it violates the KISS principle. So it's not redundant and it's not resilient. If any one of those chinks breaks, it's over. Two, it's difficult to hold accountable because most people don't understand who's actually making the decisions in this chain process. And then also it's so vast that no one person can control it. I mean, maybe a government could try to, but it really can't. Whereas, what you just described is immediate. There's not many steps in between it. Whoever is managing these animals is accountable. He's your neighbor. There aren't a whole lot of intervening steps that people lose sight of what's being done. And it may not have the yields of a large industrial farm, but what it makes up for that in is accountability and control.
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm thinking about too is when you start integrating a community like that, you really start seeing why, especially in New England and then over in the UK and different parts of Europe, so, cities are within 10 miles roughly of each other. I'm saying cities, but greater locations of populace. Well, why? Because if you're traveling with a horse, 10 miles is roughly what you're going to get out of a horse between going there and back again. That allows you to set up your county fair where everybody brings out the stud horse, where everybody brings out the bull, and they're all checking them, they're all getting hands on, and they're going to end up putting this bull throughout the county, throughout the community, throughout this little 10-mile area. And that is also an independent system in that those animals are the animals that best work within that climate, with the local pasture, with the different greeneries that are growing, and so on and so forth. And so it really is. It's not independence for the sake of being independent, which I think is one of the things that libertarianism and different preppers can kind of sort of go into, almost just this contrarian idea. But it's independent in that it is self-sustaining within the community.
Yes. And I think so. We can talk about the material hurdles to homesteading. You have to acquire a certain amount of capital, you have to acquire a certain amount of land, and the capital is necessary for starting up the homestead and for also paying wages to hired hands. But I think there's another hurdle which is as difficult, or maybe even more difficult to cross, because we sort of hinted at the idea of working together. There doesn't really seem to be an integrated philosophy of why we do this or why we should want to do this, because a lot of people do it for individualist reasons and, as you said, social reasons. And so if it does start, it doesn't seem to have a lot of generational success. A lot of these homesteaders, their children and grandchildren aren't doing it. And so we have a retention problem, and we also have a recruitment problem. And part of that is because I believe that we don't have a sort of unified, integrated philosophy of why we're doing it. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Dude, you are like I mean, we could sit here for hours pulling a Thomas Jefferson with some pipes, and I mean, like we're not going to get to the bottom of that. That's a yeah. So, um, when we okay, there's a lot of different ways to go about this. Okay, I think it was maybe A that I heard talking about this, and or maybe it was something I was reading, but it's sort of this idea that Russia and the U.S. to some degree are uniquely agrarian, and that's cool in one way because there was so much land and so many natural resources that we really were able to spread out and have these huge herds of cattle and different things going on. The bad thing about that, though, in comparison to countries that either had denser populations or frankly, somewhere like England where it had a much smaller land mass, is that we can separate ourselves from the agricultural ideas, from the giant fields, from the herds, and seeing how we're putting those together. And so I don't know that there's a magic bullet, but I know for me there is a lady panda, and we are intentional about dealing with local folks out here, and then other couples that have small holdings. And so, like, for example, just being intentional about community, we're going to have we're going to call it second annual because the idea is to have it every year, but we're going to be having our second annual harvest party this fall, just to be like, okay, this is not only is this what we're doing and what we're involved in, but this is what folks want their kids exposed to, want to see how we are all tying together and producing something. And it is sort of these pie in the sky ideas, but boy, I don't know beyond 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 hope, right? Beyond hope and looking towards the future, I don't really know how you can convince people that this is something that not only can be done but should be done.
Okay, this is I get the problem. It's a problem that I'm still dealing with too. But let me give you an analogy, and I want to get your feedback on. So imagine the cross section of a funnel. So imagine like we're looking down on the cross section of a funnel, and it's filled with some liquid, and then we have like a valve which is pushing that liquid forward, so it's in a smaller and smaller space as it goes out the spout of the funnel. Now, if we use that as an analogy for the death of an old age, and on the other side of the funnel is the new age, and the people that survive are those that got through it, what's going to end up happening is we're going to have less and less space to maneuver as that valve pushes the fluid into the funnel, into a smaller and smaller space, which, well, one will probably increase violence, but in competition for resources, which we can get to later if we want. But and we'll just call that the next 50 years. If you know where you need to be to survive, and you just sort of place yourself right at the front of the tube, people will end up coming to you. This is not a numbers game anymore, because if you can project a model or a structure to how the future is going to go, and you position yourself correctly, it'll be like positioning yourself downstream of a river that changed its course, and everybody will come to you. So I think that is the way we need to think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think another part to that though is sort of like the idea that the the right wing ascendancy is all but ensured, and it's not that we're in total control of that, but sort of like you said, we feel the pressure that's coming in, and to be pompous, it's like for those that have eyes to see, like we see it, and it's pressing against us, and so if we can at the very least try to figure out how we're going to pick our footing in the midst of that, that absolutely is going to give us the best chance to thrive in the midst of that. And it goes back, we were talking pre-show, and it's this idea of like winter is coming, but dude, that's where we were forged. I mean, we are the European diaspora. We learned to talk with horses. Wolves decided they wanted to hunt with us. Like
So,
we're ready for this. Let's just keep moving and let's make it happen.
so I think one way to contextualize what you're saying is this: the right wing ascendancy is ensured because the machine is collapsing, and the left has placed its bets on the machine continuing to exist. Post scarcity future, automation, Star Trek utopia, and of course, as that disintegrates underneath our feet, they will be unable to survive and function because their lifestyle is predicated on the continuance of these systems, which if they go, they go. They either have to adapt and change, which makes them right wing, or they go extinct. And I think it's this broad arc that's forcing this change.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't stand on shifting sand. And so,
Yes.
this is all going on. We see, as you talked about, the different systems are collapsing. It's unsustainable. It's unsustainable. And eventually you run out of boogeyman's to fight. And so while they're over there chasing these ghosts and these wisps of ideas, okay, we have the luxury still of order and of peace and of uh, the the final gasps of the system. So in the midst of that, dude, if it's not our time to shine, it is our time to build. It is our time to get off shifting sand and figure out what that means in our particular context, and whether that means actual land holdings, whether that means teaching others. Um, everything we do is going to take theory, and is going to take a basis of hope, but it's going to be translating that into something that is material.
Yeah.
And so how?
So
Yeah, go ahead.
the sort of way that I look at it throughout, well, granted, 17 years ago, I wouldn't have talked about collapse in terms of environmental or industrial factors. I was reading Pat Buchanan then, so I would have attributed it to like quote diversity, all these immigrants coming in. Polyglot empires never last very long, which is just a general trend. But we can add all these other problems as well, which I don't need to get into at the moment. So the real point is this: you have to ask yourself, given a period of maximum flux, where it is as uncertain as it's possible to be, you have to then ask yourself, given previous periods in human history, what are the only courses of action that could work? Doesn't mean they will work, but it means we have to narrow down what we're going to use our resources on. And I think what people haven't really come to grips with yet, even in our side of the aisle, is that there's only really a handful of strategies that could possibly work, and we just need to hammer down on those come hell or high water. And I just don't see people as being ready for that yet.
Yeah, and I mean, so on the super micro scale, we all just need to embrace Trumpton. Like energy is going to start leaving us, and we have to be able to wean ourselves off of reliance for it. Not just in a practical sense, but also in a comfort sense. Like
Yeah.
we have to do hard things, and that's going to help us grow. That's going to help us understand like what is the better path. It's a lot easier to do, you know, 100 feet worth of a rock wall after you've gotten used to climbing 5 to 15 feet of a rock wall.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have like two groups of people that I think need to become in closer contact, because any successful movement is going to be one part theory, one part praxis. And the problem that we have is the theoreticians can't do the praxis and the practical people can't do the theoretical work. So one, they can't really switch their roles, but two, they're not really in dialogue with each other. And so in the American context, they tend to resent each other, when in actual fact, they need to be working together.
Sorry, I couldn't get a hold of my mic there for a minute, but yeah, this is like, I mean, part of what I'm being reminded of is, oh, what did he call it? The red heart and blue eyes, the Distributus latest vid. He's talking, you know, we have to be able to see these things, because we can't walk away from, hmm, let's take agriculture out of it. Let's take homesteading out of it, right? Like there's always going to be the practical side of how do we feed our bellies and what is the material things that we're working within. But I mean, as you've already talked about too, what is the theory of it? Because the theory that we've been following has been not even practical, but it's been this ephemeral, touchy feely thing, particularly post Hart Cellar, post 1960s, of like what feels good, not what matters. What, because even okay, even Lincoln, even Woodrow Wilson, there was sort of this mad algorithm that was still focused, I think at least, not just on power, but also on how to help the country thrive in a way. And that has been totally torn asunder and tossed aside, post 1960s, post World War II, and we are just running on. Okay, well, the I mean, to be vulgar, I guess we're just running on the feminization of the West, and to what end, I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's not going to be a good one. But you also mentioned how people need to get used to not using electricity or a lot of other conveniences. Ultimately, we can sort of talk about this in terms of mental toughness, right? So, right, there could be a situation on the battlefield where a soldier is otherwise physically prepared for what's coming, but he's not mentally prepared. He's not mentally tough, and he doesn't make it for whatever reason. A lot of, I think, preppers are analogous to that soldier. They may have actually all the right materials, but they believe things that are not really true or a part of the machine and don't really fully realize it, and they're not really mentally tough enough to understand like what it's actually going to mean to go through this. And a lot of people intuitively understand you need to get into quote physical shape, physical fitness, which is true. But there's a level of like mental shape and mental toughness that I think goes far more unaddressed, which will actually be the Achilles heel of a lot of groups.
Yeah, so that's a big one in that, you can sit here and you can think about what it's going to mean when you slaughter an animal. But when you go out there and you start your homestead and you've got one ram and two ewes, and one of those ewes is dying, and you don't know why, and you've only got $200 left in the bank, you can't replace that animal. Like, how do you your flock is ending before it's even started? And that's a super micro example. And you talked a lot. I can't remember if it was the first one on collapse or the second, but there's going to be potentially a lot of self-owning as we start going through these harder things. And absolutely, and that is one more reason why, I tell guys, like, keep your job, keep earning money. You're going to need cash flow, but start yesterday. Whether it's chickens, whether it's okay. Here's a real simple one. Save up some money. It's going to be an investment. Save yourself $300 or $400. Get yourself a good pair of Red Wings, of Knicks, of Whites leather boots. Get yourself some boot oil, and take good care of those for a year. Right? That $300-400. It's an investment. It's not painless when you go and spend that money, and you're actually going to have to upkeep on what's a relatively simple instrument. It's leather that's been stitched to a piece of rubber. But start taking care of that. Start building, and that's just one way in which you can start building. Uh, Shoot, I can't even think of the daggum word right now. Just not a thrifting, a hardiness. Excuse me. Just building a hardiness to your environment and to the inputs that you're putting in. And so it only, golly, start with boots, and it only scales up from there. But eventually you get to a point where, okay, I've got, so speaking for myself, I've got headed towards about five dozen head of sheep right now. And how many did I lose this year? I've lost about 12 this year between selling some, culling some others. Some ended up getting labor stuck in delivery, and I had to pull lambs, or I had to end up putting down the ewes. And those numbers, selectively culling 12 head of sheep, are numbers that I couldn't have even imagined 3 years ago. And you just keep building, and you're going to get hard. You're going to get tough to it. And no, I think you're right on line, because this is small potatoes compared to weaning ourselves off of electricity, off of even that. I mean, that sounds so crazy. I'm not saying go Amish, but I'm just saying, like, there's going to be trials, and we're going to have to be detoxing from the system and building a new one. And so we might as well start now.
Yes. The other thing I was thinking of as we were discussing is, because you mentioned what happens if one of your ewes is getting sick. This is I think what would be extremely helpful and needs to happen is we need an army of theory cells who scour 19th century livestock publications on how people were raising animals and treating animals prior to the machine taking over. But we still have written accounts because it was still America with the printing press. And then just figure out how people did it before. Because I think a lot of people just don't know. And they're just doing it by trial and error, which, okay, you might have to. But if you don't have to, don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, right off the bat, a crazy resource for this would be Peace Corps manuals. You can go online, you can still find them. And the Peace Corps is going in there, and they're working with different tribes in Africa and trying to domesticate different animals or put in different animals for draft work. And we have all of this online. On top of that, I mean, I won't get into the weeds right now, but yeah, I can send you stuff on books that have been published in the last decade on how to raise horses, how to breed horses, how to drive horses. When I came out here, I'm like, let's start a farm, because that'll be the easiest thing in the world, and let's use horses because I'm all about easy. So, I came out here, I learned how to drive horses, and we have to be able to take this knowledge. First of all, like you just said, we have to be able to acquire it. All the good old boys are dying. The last ones who really saw stuff were the baby boomers, and they weren't even doing it, but they saw grandpa doing it. And slowly but surely, this knowledge is going the way of the dinosaur. I mean, it's literally becoming extinct. And so, like you had talked about in the other streams, is this idea of the people the reenactors, they're going to have so much different knowledge. but the knowledge is still out there. You ever heard of the Foxfire books?
No.
It's just it is. I think you might dig it because on top of the practical stuff, it's also just like old backwoods stories and like mountain lore. And I think it's all coming out of Appalachia. But yeah, the Foxfire books are great just to sort of get acquainted, not even necessarily to the practical stuff, but to the soul of it, right? And this idea of like, well, Grandpa, he used to and he had them lands, and they just like 40 pounds, and it just to see how folks used to think, and so that's great. But then it's also, how do we get that knowledge out to folks, and this is also where community starts coming in, right? Like I laugh with folks, and it's like, so I did it. I came out of the suburbs and I started doing all this stuff, but it's like if you give me 1 month, I can get nearly anybody to a point where they can be running their property with horses. If you get me 6 months, I can get that same guy to where he can teach that. I mean, shoot, you give me a year and give me Panama Hat, and we'll probably have mounted infantry and same work in draft or whatever. But you have to dig in on it, and you have to be able to start disseminating it as best you can.
Right. And the other thing that you need, okay, so we need that prerequisite knowledge in order to do it again. But also, let's say we get to a point where we have, say, veterinarians and animal livestock husbandmen who are familiar enough with this material to deal with animals and their illnesses. We now have another problem. We have been growing up in a toxic environment with microplastics and poison food and everything, and the animals have still been affected by that too. So we not only have to pick up where our forebears left off, we then have to spitball solutions for problems they never had to deal with, which, I mean, that just makes it so much more challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing it's a black pill or a white pill, depending on how you want to look at it. It's like the alleviation of Darwinian pressures ultimately are going to become Darwinian pressures in and of themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, and so what we're going to be left with in 100 years, because I tend to think collapse is going to be relatively slow and take a while, but absolutely, I think we're also already in the beginning of it. Excuse me,
So,
I got a little bit
yeah, yeah.
sidetracked. But so I think we're in the beginning of it. But the cattle that we have 100 years from now aren't necessarily going to be the remnants of the Angus, of the Hereford, of the Highland, or whatever, but are going to be those that could thrive in the midst of the microplastics and the trash and climate change and so on and so forth. Regardless, I'm throwing that out as an example, regardless of.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I want to kind of move into is that on the one hand, these challenges are vast and imposing and intimidating, and a lot of people might be, discouraged and just throw in the hat now. Well, the first thing I'd say is there's no back to go back to. The world that we thought we had is over and it's dying. And going back to it isn't a solution because you will then just die with it. So the first thing you have to remember is there's no back to go back to. There's only forward. The second thing is there you have to figure out what could work because there's only a few things that could work. There's no guarantees in life that will work, but you can then say you did the best you could. In that sense, you would be correct in saying that. Most people, I don't think you say that, do that, but that's not really here nor there. And the other thing too is a lot of these challenges are going to, I think, in one sense, be short-lived. And this is where, so in the early stages of like serious collapse, I think we could see a lot of violence. But One, there's going to be, if we looked at a map of North America, there'd basically be a heat map where like bright red is like super violent and like dark blue is like no violence based on geographic and population factors. So that's going to happen regardless. And then over time, the deep red hotspots will turn cooler because the pressures for violence go away. One is, why do we have endemic violence in cities? Because criminals immediately go to the hospital and get put back together again. That way of life will end pretty quick when everybody just gets shot up and dies. And even before that, when Luca Luciano organized the mob into this broad alliance of different subdivisions of racketeering, they're like, well, it's just more profitable to work together than knife each other all the time. So even without the environmental pressures, that will happen. But then furthermore, as the environmental pressures, scarce resources, high population, as that goes away, and you were able to survive that short period of intense violence, I think the drive for violence will go down. One, because there's no more, resource competition or very little of it now. Also, without modern medicine, a knife wound will kill you in many cases. So people will have a self-preservation instinct kick in. And then both of us, coming from a Christian perspective, would also say that while man can commit some pretty terrible crimes, he can also do some amazingly selfless things. And people kind of live up or down to their expectations. So if you expect everybody to fail, everybody to be a psychopath, well, then you'll probably be in a position where you're surrounded only by psychopaths. It's a selection bias because you don't team up with people that aren't sociopaths because you've conditioned yourself to believe they're not real. So but what if we assume that some people rise to the occasion, like, for example, spiritual leaders, plus the reduction of competition for resources, after maybe the first decade or so, things should settle down. It wouldn't, I'm not saying it's going to be a cakewalk, but it's not going to be Mad Max either. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, well, and it's one we share because, yeah, it's faith, hope, and love. We're made in God's image. I read The Road. I got all twisted up about The Road. I got all twisted up about Black River. I got, oh, we're always going to be fighting. And man, it's like, well, there's been a lot of times through history where not only could we have been as evil as possible, we could have ended ourselves more or less. And rare is the civilization who has done that. And so if we start building our, go ahead, yeah.
No, I just thought you were done.
Yeah, sorry. Rare is the civilization that has done that and that has torn themselves asunder. If we can start building our resiliency now, in whatever means that takes, if it's not homesteading, if it's just getting back into church, if it's not even getting into church, if it's just spending some time in prayer and trying to see, is there some sort of bigger picture that's taking place here? Resiliency is not going to be wasted. It's not going to be wasted on you. It's not going to be wasted on those around you. It's not going to be wasted on any progeny. And frankly, whether that progeny is of blood or whether you are the community uncle who has all the stories to tell, this stuff isn't wasted. So if we can start digging in right now, yeah, it's not going to be pretty, but when has life ever been pretty? It's been pretty in those moments where we were able to a fair degree, live life on our own terms and dictate what was going to happen to us.
Yeah. What Uncle Ted calls the power process. And we lose that with technology, and that's part of where a lot of these problems come from. But I think it's so important for people to understand this, to double back on the question of mental toughness, is that this isn't the first time humans have been in a situation like this. So the first thing to do is read about, understand, and appreciate that crises like this, not everybody dies. There are going to be survivors. And it's usually not an accident what determines who the survivors are. They did something right. So keep that in mind. And then I think a lot of people are going to have a mental breakdown precisely because they lack a context into which to place all this. Right? If you were post 1945, you were told that everything was going to be easy and abundant and safe. And if you have no prior knowledge of history and that's all you know, because not to pick on you, but let's say all you did was play video games, you're not going to have that context. And so you're just going to, for example, during the Great Depression, when people learned they lost their entire life savings in a bank crash, they just had a heart attack and died. That's probably going to happen to a lot of people. But, you can prepare for that. And you prepare for that by understanding that other people went through similar challenges and came out on the other end.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really is like that resilience. Like it's so cringe, and it's like second grade in school, and it's like, oh, my teachers used to say this garbage, but it is like, what is one of the common attributes of people that succeed in life is that they failed a lot and they just kept going. Like, so if we know failure is going to happen, and we know we're not going to get this homesteading thing perfect, or this community thing perfect, or so on and so forth, it's like, might as well try while the trying is relatively easy. So let's keep doing it. And yeah, I think there's a ton of hope to be had, not just from history, but from our own spirit.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually a good place to end. So I guess firstly, do you have any more final thoughts? And then second of all, where can people find you and your content or work?
So I don't really have any content. I think I got on X, Twitter, like, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or something, and I mainly just requote. But I mean, yeah, if anybody has any questions about homesteading, about farming, about building a business or whatever, right now, and the different ways you can approach it, feel free to contact me. What's my handle? It's at Wander Mr. Panda. So that would be the big thing. And then I had something, but I lost it. That happens to me a fair bit. But no, this was great. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I mean, start homesteading. Take that word homesteading, use it, describe it, define it however you want. But you should have started yesterday. Since you didn't start yesterday, you need to start today.
All right. Well, we did get one question that I'd like to read before we end. Imperator of Force says, thoughts on Richmond north of Richmond. So I guess that's to you.
Okay. Well, here is my thoughts on it. I didn't listen to it, and I won't listen to it.
Okay.
I'm stepping over it.
All right. Well, thank you, Wandering Panda. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.
Thank you much, Todd.